Thank you. You didn't have one like me. You never had that problem.
Okay, all right, bye.
Board of Health is going to sit there, 2, 3, 4.
There's another table. Add to the.
Okay.
But we have some time if you want to.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, you can call a meeting to order.
The audience could please take their seats. We'll get started here. We're starting at 6:45 tonight. Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for coming. At this time, I'd like to call the March 13th, 2012 Planning Board meeting to order. The first item on the agenda, and there are no agendas for the audience here yet, and it's pretty straightforward, and I will explain that. First item on the agenda are minutes from the February 28, 2012 meeting. Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Chairman, I recommend that we approve the February 28th minutes as corrected.
Second.
Any further discussion? Corrections, I believe, were basically just grammatical things and spelling and that kind of thing? Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstained? Motion carries. Next item on the agenda is an approval not required. The applicant, Mary Ellen Molloy of 43 Church Street, Nominee Trust, to subdivide 7.49 acres into 3 lots located at 43 Church Street, Woods Hole. Is there,
And Mr. Chairman, there's a letter from the applicant.
Okay. Mr. Curry, thank you. This letter is to the Falmouth Planning Board from Holmes and McGrath, the civil engineers and land surveyors for this project. Dear board member, or dated March 13th, which is today. Dear board members, the scheduled public hearing for the above referenced project is tonight, Tuesday, March 13th, 2012. The applicant would like additional time to address the town planner's concerns. Please accept this letter as a request to withdraw the application. The application will be refiled after the plan can be reviewed with the town planner. If you have any questions, please call or write me. Sincerely, Michael McGrath of Holmes and McGrath, President.
So you need a motion by the board to take no action at the request of the applicant.
I will so move it.
Second.
Further discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstained? The motion carries.
That is why we didn't have a plan on the table.
That is precisely correct. And that's how we do that.
Okay. The next item on the agenda is discussion of the wind turbine bylaw.
And
We are waiting for this is a joint meeting, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, between the Planning Board and the Board of Health.
and that will start at 7 o'clock.
And that will start at 7. So you have about 10 minutes to discuss something amongst yourselves, so I'll take a...
You can take a recess until 7
I'll take a
o'clock.
motion, or I declare a recess until 7 o'clock. And I
There's no question.
would like to remind the audience that we will not be taking public comment at tonight's meeting. There will be ample opportunity to do that after we develop our bylaw, where we will have public hearings. And I believe that the Board of Health, if they draft a bylaw, they intend to hold hearings also. So with that, we are in recess until 7 o'clock.
you gotta get below that clay, or the system's, then you have to fill it back up again with sand, because you can't have it be a 30-foot system. You gotta replace all the clay. That's where it gets real expensive. That's how it...
Ladies and gentlemen, the Board of Health is here. They're downstairs. They'll be here momentarily. You can continue your conversations. I just wanted to let you know that they will be here momentarily.
Should they turn the mic so you don't have to hammer? Be careful.
Ross said so. It's in here. The chairman of the Board of Health.
You better be careful.
Doug, I'm sorry, I moved you down. Sorry, partner. For those of you who have come in just recently, we will not be taking any public comments tonight, but you will have ample opportunity to speak once the planning board has developed their draft of the bylaw concerning the future of wind turbines here in town, specifically dealing with safety issues and nuisances. The Board of Health, on the other hand, will be developing their own regulation concerning health issues, and they will be holding hearings also. So just wanted you to know that I don't want you to be offended that we're not interested in what you have to say, but we just can't take it tonight. We need to discuss amongst ourselves so that we don't overlap our duplication of effort in our jurisdictions. We're still in recess, so feel free to converse. They are. Come on up. Yeah, come on up. Still be short a chair? You have 5 or do you have 4 tonight?
We have 5, the chair is on the way out.
Okay. We're going to need one more chair, I think, Brian.
We can move on if you...
Okay.
Why don't you save that for the...
All right, we'll just slide one more up here.
You can put a chair here, whichever.
This is fine.
Let's take a vote.
You have the,
Hello.
I get to be up here.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't know.
Can she get by?
Thank you.
Since you don't have nameplates, I'm just going to ask everybody to introduce themselves to the audience.
Downstairs, if David
Here.
He was just there. He's outside the door, I think. Hey, Jeff.
You want to take a minute and
Jen,
send somebody?
is David outside? Would you, yeah, I just saw him too. We need our name tags.
Can you get the nameplates where you're...
Yeah, somebody will...
Oh, okay. We have them.
You do? Oh, great. Oh, great.
Not here.
At this time, I'd like to reconvene the joint meeting between the Board of Health and the Planning Board. Tonight's discussion, we had some agendas that we passed out in the audience, and if you didn't get one, maybe you could share one with a neighbor. Tonight we'll be discussing the wind turbine bylaw, the Department of Health and Department of Environmental Protection wind turbine health impact study, the jurisdiction on noise, health, and versus nuisance, and the time frame for November town meeting. The people with the black name plates are from the planning board, and those with the paper and tan nameplates are folks from the Board of Health. We also have with us Mr. Kerrigan from the Board of Health, and Mr. Curry and Ms. McCollum from the planning board. So, welcome, and I would like to advise everyone that this joint meeting was at the request of the Board of Health. We're looking not to avoid duplication of effort and make sure that we concentrate on the areas that are germane to our boards. So with that, Gail, Ms. Harkness, as Chairman of the Board of Health, would you like to start with this evening's agenda?
I am going to defer to our Vice Chair, who has taken the lead on this issue for the Board of Health, and that's Jack Goldstone.
Yes, sir.
So just to summarize, one of the recent changes in information that's become officially available to us, the state in January released a wind turbine health impact study, and the public comment for that closes this coming Monday. And so we've been reviewing that and have commented to the state. The health impact study is sort of advisory to the state, to the DEP and the DPH as to potential or actual health impacts from wind turbines. Because it's not a final rule from the DEP or the DPH, we've commented on it, but can't act on it because the DEP hasn't handed us any rule changes. But in summary, we've sort of summarized some of the findings, have looked at that, and particularly in reference to our experience in Falmouth, because the Board of Health has been, residents have commented to the Board of Health extensively over the last year and almost 2 years now. But there were a number of issues identified by the state that require further study. And we have requested that the DEP, in the interim, before they really undertake any major studies, actually give us some altered regulatory guidance. So that's kind of where we are at the moment, where we have spoken with a number of the residents. Many of them are here tonight. And it was sort of eloquently summarized by George Heufelder in particular that we can't really get out in front of the science, and so we have requested from the DEP explicit guidance as to when we can regulate. But until they finalize the rules, we don't have anything beyond what is currently in place in regulations.
Okay, thank you. Our point person on the planning board for this issue is Pat Kirkwood, and our staff point person is Marlene McCollum, and we reviewed the same study that you did on February 7th, I think it was, or some February 10th or something, our first meeting in February. And what we did was we tried to separate out the issues that were in the report that would be more germane to the planning board concerning nuisance and safety. And with that, I'll let Pat explain to you how that meeting went and what our conclusions were up to that point.
Well, there were multiple things that came out of that report when we reviewed it. And the big one that we all seem to agree on is that in many instances, although the state said there are no direct health impacts, they also said, but we don't really want to define it because it isn't really well enough known and studied yet. And our thought was, okay, they had only 4 peer-reviewed studies that they determined were satisfactory for them to review, but they also determined that those had not been replicated and they were too diverse to draw any real conclusions out of that. So the takeaway in general from the whole report was that the group really recommended that the state start doing some of these definitive studies to be able to define what might be health effects and how they could be handled. And that sort of is what you're saying. We can't jump ahead of the science isn't there, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yes, the full science isn't there. It's sort of a range, so the definitive science isn't there. There's enough data to suggest that there are thresholds that could be addressed and as an interim preventative measure.
Right.
And that's what we have put in our response to the wind turbine docket, but also in an explicit request to the DEP to address in the interim of these studies, which may take some time, give us some additional regulatory measures beyond the current standard, which is clearly not right.
Not right, yeah. There are other things that were pulled out of the report. There was a table that was pointed at as to the various DBAs you could look at, but they had no confidence in the table, that it was really realistic. It's pretty obvious that there was a difference between night and day as to how people perceive the sound, and therefore what they choose to call annoyance, it seems to be called annoyance. Our bylaws deal with nuisance, and nuisance is more capable of being regulated. That came out of our meeting.
I believe the law is that noise as regulated as pollution, as air pollution, and the regulations are tender written as nuisance, and our authority, the Board of Health authority, is as nuisance. Annoyance can have a medical, in this case, sort of a medical terminology. It's a little hazy.
Okay, when we're looking at the definitions, which is what we did when we looked at it as a board, annoyance was, in the way we looked at it, less serious. You can be annoyed with something, but a nuisance can tend to have more effects, and we looked up the definition in, what is it, Black's Law? Is that what it was? And so we were looking at that. Yeah.
I think it was more that the nuisance was more related to property rights.
Yeah.
Private
Thanks.
nuisance relates to individual property being affected by use on adjacent or nearby property. Public nuisance has to do with annoyance of the public in general, and the really only difference between nuisance and annoyance is semantic and more specific application of nuisance to land. Nuisance, the word comes from the French for smelliness.
I want to actually step back a little bit from nuisance, because it is a term that is imprecise and fraught with complications. One of the major things that was noted was that noise can have an effect on sleep. And from what we have talked about and what numerous reports have looked at is the effect of various noise thresholds on different sleep aspects, which are something that you could actually measure and quantify. And but in particular has actual noted effects on health. And so they did, one of the major points in this study, this particular impact study, was that no studies adequately examined the influence of wind turbines on sleep and sleep disruption. One of the major factors that we have looked at and have considered is the impacts on sleep and the fragmentation and the interruption of sleep, which then cascade to leading to increased annoyance and then increased stress and various other health outcomes stemming specifically from the disruption of sleep. Because sleep is something that can be objectively measured and not subjectively measured in terms of an individual's self-reported annoyance, it is something that can be more, at least in theory, more accurately regulated. Those require studies, however. It's clear from the literature, however, that self-reported awakenings are actually, there are fewer, if a person's experiencing noise-associated awakenings or sleep disruptions, the number that are actually measured using various types of objective measurements, biometric measurements, is about tenfold what is actually self-reported. So so the thresholds for what people report and what are actually happening are different, and there isn't enough data for this sort of noise, however, to be able to understand it yet. So that's one of the reasons. That's one of the things that we have been focusing on.
One big problem, and that is you're going to have to get anything conclusive out of that. You're going to need a huge sample over a long period of time, because there are so many factors that will interfere with sleep on any given individual at any time. There's stress, there's illness, there's light, ambient light, there's noise coming from the household as opposed to noise coming from elsewhere. So, so to just say, well, we're going to do one study of 100 people over a week and come up with some conclusions, you can't do that. You have to come up with what you're talking about. In order to control for all these other factors that might be in there, you have to have a wide study that, and then be able to isolate that wind turbine noise as being distinct from all the other possible factors that could affect sleep. So that's...
I agree, and I mean, for example, one of the factors is age, and as you age, you become your sleep becomes significantly more fragmented, and you become significantly more susceptible to awakenings and increased fragmentation.
I can attest to that, by the way.
I can attest to it, too.
And so, especially as Falmouth ages, in ages in place, the sensitivity to these types of disruptions may increase. However, there's a sufficient body of evidence for other types of noise altering health outcomes and changing sleep patterns, that it should be possible to fit some of the wind turbine noise into that framework and understand it better. You were right, though. That's one of the reasons that we have requested more rapid guidance from the state than would be if they waited for the definitive studies on this.
Yeah, Pat.
Ralph, could I comment?
Sure.
I mean,
John.
one of the things that we've noticed, if you look at the literature on wind turbines, they typically say that when the wind is not blowing very, very hard, there's a greater difference between background noise and the noise that the turbine makes. And that in theory, that's when these turbines are the most objectionable. The Falmouth experience has been just the reverse. If you look at our complaint log, it hasn't been at low wind speed, it's been at high wind speeds that the complaints have been most obvious. And so clearly there's a disconnect between our experience and what is in the classical literature. And so one of the things which we as a board have done is said, our noise regulation now is an A-rated spectral noise rating, which is the range that the human ear hears. And what we've said to the DEP is, we're not sure that an A-weighted spectral analysis of the wind turbines is appropriate. And just from our observations and the complaints that we're getting. And so one of the things we're pushing the state to do is, it'll be years before these studies can be done. But we know that we are having impacts at certain distances from our turbines, and that the A-weighted spectrum doesn't seem to be quantifying that effectively. And so it would seem to us that one of the things the state can do is it a combination of an A-weighted and a C-weighted spectrum that is a more appropriate measure, and something that you could hang a bylaw on, for instance, as a planning board, in siting future turbines. Because clearly, it's at least it seems to us that A-weighted spectrum is not appropriate. So there's where I think we can anticipate some help from the state more immediately, and that is the type of data that we need to both regulate from a Board of Health's perspective, and to develop a bylaw which is meaningful in siting turbines in the future.
Chair, can I ask?
One second,
I'm going to
Rich.
explain-
One second, please. 1 second. Ken wanted to speak.
Well, it was just a question that I wanted to ask. When you mentioned that the studies show that possibly it could be tenfold more sleep interruptions than what is actually being reported, was that? I didn't hear.
There
could be a possibility.
I mean, it depends on the type of study you look at and the type of measurement for how awakenings are measured, basically. So, but in one summary, that was sort of the rough, was a rough estimate of a particular type of awakening. That was probably the most sensitive way of measuring a sleep fragmentation. It's not necessarily full awakening.
But there's a potential that there could be.
But you come up out of sleep, partially out of sleep, and then go back down into it and report it.
Yeah, Rich.
Yeah, I would like Mr. Monterey to explain some of the terms of art here. A-weighted spectrum, C-weighted spectrum. We'll put those into layman's terms as to what you're talking about.
The A-rated spectral, Jed is probably better at this than I am. A-rated is what the human ear normally is the range of the human ear.
It's sort of the median sensitivity of human hearing, it's not a flat curve. It discounts those frequencies that we are less sensitive to. But you can still hear it.
Take a stab at it. If there's a range of sound you can hear, there's frequencies starting over here and going over
So
here.
you're talking about frequency?
No, just stay with me for a second. And on the A-weighted scale, what they do is they multiply everything over here on the low end by 0.1. I don't know the exact numbers. And the high numbers they multiply by 1.4. So they actually carry a little more weight for the higher frequencies than the lower frequencies, because that's what hurts your eardrums.
It actually tails off at the higher frequencies, too.
And it tails off the back.
Yeah.
There's a frequency they zero in on because they know that certain frequencies affect your hearing. And so the A-weighted scale was built over time and is used as a common measurement because it's designed to protect hearing. And so there's a whole series of different weighting scales that can be used for different reasons. And as you move up from the A to the higher letters in the alphabet, you start shifting the weighting that you do to different parts of the element. So we've looked at this, we've come back to the C scale a little bit because it carries a little more equal balance of the lower frequencies, which seem to be the frequencies of concern from the speed of the turbines.
You know, I thought John was talking about a disconnect between complaint-driven analyses here and complaint-driven analyses elsewhere, am I correct?
Normally, at least in the classical literature on wind turbines, they're said to be the most objectionable at low wind speeds because the difference between the ambient noise, which is less, and the noise that the turbine is making is the greatest.
When you say objectionable, that's based upon analysis of subjective complaints, or is it based upon some different kind
I
of...
think that's based on complaints.
Okay, and
But-
what we're talking about here is complaints also.
That's right, but it seems...
So, well, let me just finish the thought. So we're getting a disconnect between the complaint-driven findings regarding our wind turbines and the ones in general. Could that not mean that there's a problem with the turbines we're talking about here, which are only 3, by the way, and what is generally an acceptable standard for the equipment also? Could that be a possibility? And isn't that something we would want to know before we started, just adopting bylaws to just change the, to limit the whole issue and limit everybody's right to develop this kind of energy? Wouldn't we want to know whether the difference that you're perceiving is maybe based on the equipment? Because we're getting a totally different result.
There's that, I think the same sorts of problems have been occurring at Woodsole Research, the complaints.
Look at that first.
It's a different sort of noise, I think, that's being generated from the actual, it's from the actual generator in that case.
John, wouldn't Hawkins raise and say, look at that one first, and then goes into more comprehensive explanation?
Well, I think though this is where, this goes beyond the expertise which we have here in town. And this is why I think we need guidance from the state.
I think that the idea of annoyance of a sound over a background in terms of seeing a difference between the generated sound and your background, where the annoyance is going to be largest, where that difference is largest, is sort of just kind of, it's sort of the idea that intuitively kind of makes sense, but certainly in this case, and possibly in a number of other cases of wind turbines, it appears to be not true. That it's an assumption carried forth through, and the consultants have presented this, and the wind studies have presented this, but it really does appear to be different, and not necessarily just in Falmouth, but in other places as well. Now, I have not done a deep study of loud industrial sounds, switching yards and jet planes and this and that, to say whether or not that's a general case.
It's an objective fact that we have differences in subjective reactions depending upon where, and I would say also, what is being used, what equipment is being used, location and equipment. If you have a difference, high wind speeds produce more complaints in one location, low wind speeds produce more complaints in another location, whether there are others in Falmouth as well. It would seem to me that, first of all, instead of looking at, well, do we have the right analysis of what we're looking at in terms of the range of frequencies, why don't we look at the range of frequencies that are being produced by the equipment first, and look at that issue rather than a whole complex issue of distances and topography. Just look at the equipment and see if that accounts for it.
That would seem to be based upon sound science. You don't go looking for the more complex solution or the complex explanation without first eliminating the more simple ones.
Yeah, Pat.
I'm going to have to dispute that, because I do live close enough to the one on Woods Hole Road to speak from personal experience. The stronger the wind is, the louder it is.
I'm not denying that, but apparently there are numerous wind facilities in the world that have been studied where just the opposite is true. So rather than say this is based upon what you're measuring in terms of frequencies as opposed to maybe just what different frequencies those particular units are putting out as opposed to other units, maybe that's the issue. Is what technology is being used, if that's the issue, why don't we look at that one first before going into, regulating across the board with things like setbacks and nuisance issues and things like that. Why don't we look at that first? Why don't we ask for a study that determines what equipment was being used in each of these studies and see if there's a difference in the equipment, a difference in the design, a difference in the age, etc.
Doug?
Yeah, it also could just be a case of that's just the guidelines that the state is throwing out there, and we might find that in our experience it's not that case. We might have to develop our own plan.
Well, okay. Yeah, Jim?
Yeah, I think there's in this particular issue, there's a little divergence between our two boards. I think for us, on the planning board, that we can define, a nuisance level above ambient sound levels. I think some of the reports say an increase of 10 decibels, so that's something that can be measured, and if that's that's a property issue coming into a neighbor. Whether or not it's a health issue, that's your issue, but I think it's pretty easy to measure the sound level on our side of it. And all these other issues about the types of turbines and whatever, if it's making a noise and it's coming across the property line, it's measured at a certain level of increase, it's either a nuisance or it isn't. That's something we have the ability to measure now.
Wait, Rich.
And also, I think that needs to be done when they measure it. It needs to be when the ambient noise that's at its lowest. You can't say, well, there's a highway running by and during the day, but at night when there's no traffic, that differential has to be, that nuisance can't happen at any time during the day. The level, that increase in the ambient noise of whatever, I think it's 10 decibels, whatever that level is, that has to be at the quietest time of the day, not the noisiest time of the day. So whenever that increase happens, whether high winds or low winds, if it happens at all, it's a nuisance.
Jared, Rich, please.
So,
Jared?
just to address one of the previous questions, the separation in terms of low wind speed versus high wind speed, low ambient versus high ambient, it doesn't, I don't think it was, it's necessarily a matter of what type, something to focus on as to what type of wind turbine, what type of technology, because really what matters is what happens to people either at the property line or at their houses, sort of what we would call the receivers. So it doesn't, while what we have now may be a particular type of technology that produces a particular type of sound, and new technology may not produce that type of sound or that level of sound. Regardless, we can still measure and we can still have some sort of objective measurement of that sound and know and have some guess at what is objectionable. And that's, I think, where we're sort of, thinking forward rather than thinking backwards.
Yeah, right, yeah. Yes. No, George.
First, and then I'll go.
You want Rich to go first?
Well, he had his hand up.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
To Jim and Jared. Jim, if you want to apply you're kind of thinking a nuisance. We wouldn't have any airports, we wouldn't have any highways, we wouldn't have any trolleys, we wouldn't have any trains, we wouldn't have any factories. We'd be living in a cow pasture. I mean, this is...
But we're not talking about airports or any of those things in these locations, Richard, so that's...
No, but we are talking about a significant need, which is energy. We are being inundated. The people that live next to the highway are unknowingly breathing fumes from a day in and day out, doing much more harm to their health, and actually really a nuisance. But Jared, what you just said makes sense, except that's something that we could, instead of applying setbacks, apply performance standards.
No, that's actually what...
Performance standards would be basically equipment-based.
Right.
No, without specifying...
The equipment can meet the standards.
Sorry.
It's okay. George, George, and then Brian wants to speak.
I'd like to set this more on the stage of what Jim was bringing up. We have two different boards, we have two different jurisdictions, we have two different ways in which we look at regulations. It's been obvious that we don't have the standard tools at the Board of Health that we need. Standard tool of the Board of Health is, give me a number, tell me why you can't reach it. If you can't reach it, we'll vary it, or you'll give us something back that suits the public, that we give away a little bit of the public health, whatever, and we get back from the applicant something to compensate for it. In either of those, the implied thing is we have a number, we have something to work with. In this, it's obvious the state has not given us a number to work with, other than what we have when an air conditioner on Main Street is too loud. We can handle something like that. So it's obvious now through the state's report that we're not going to get in very short term anything that gives us the number we need to do, because that's what your Board of Health does. We look at what the Department of Public Health says makes things safe and healthy, and we enforce that. In this, we haven't got a clue. We just haven't got a clue, other than the 30 clues that meet us in the Board of Health hearing room for a couple of nights, and there's a lot of heat there. We understand something's wrong. We just don't have the tool to tell them how far over the line somebody is. What we were hoping to hear tonight, what we were hoping to sort of tease from you is, we understand that once you leave a Board of Health, and once you go into a board that is more, or should be, more in tune to the desire of a community, that doesn't necessarily have to have a nexus to a public health number, what your latitude is for your regulation. What we were hoping, of course, is you could say, okay, if 50 people show up to the room, they don't like it, we pass the regulation, we're fine. That, of course, simple and stupid. However, at some level, you are the thermometer of the community's desires, which is disconnected with the hard numbers that we have to respond to. The Board of Health is not allowed to say, we don't want that restaurant in the middle of town, we'll just call it unhealthy. No, because they'll come to us and say, where's your code, where's your Article 10 that says this is unhealthy, bada, 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 bada. And if we don't have it, we're in court and bye-bye, you're done. But we understand that your type of board has a little bit more latitude. What we had hoped would be that there would be some breathing room that you could give, not the Board of Health, but the people who are aggrieved by this, some standard that doesn't have to meet a hard-line performance standard that we're used to. Something a little bit softer that incorporates something we can't measure right now for the community. And that's where we're at. We can clearly tell you that the state has not given us a number. That's obvious, because if it was, we wouldn't be sitting there right now. They'd be enforcing the number. So what we're looking for is, as the state goes through this somewhat lengthy process, is there anything a planning board can do as far as looking? Because, see, you're the we the people. That's what you are. You're the we the people decision. You know what a Board of Health is? It's definitely one that says, we don't care what the people say because our number says this. This is the standard. So we understand the differences, and that's why I appreciated Jim bringing it up. I'm sure you still need something that is consistent, not arbitrary and capricious, in which you go back to each time and say, here is a standard by which we do this. But I will submit to you that it does not have to be as hard line as the standards we are asked to enforce weekly.
Yeah, Brian?
George read my mind, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman. He brought you back onto the agenda. Two there, so
Okay.
well done, George.
All right, I think I explained initially that we're developing a bylaw that deals with nuisance and safety. And when we met in the early part of February, we looked at the same study that the Board of Health did, and the title of that, for the benefit of the audience, is Wind Turbine Health Impact Study. So we were challenged with the fact that we had to try and break out what was in your domain and deal with what we felt was in our domain. And we dealt with, first thing we did was to talk about the definition of annoyance and nuisance and how difficult it was to break those down and discern the difference. We looked at the four different things that were raised in this report for the benefit of the public. It was noise, infrasound, which is, I believe, the low frequency sound, vibration, light flicker, and then we added our own ice throw because we felt that was definitely a safety issue. And I then asked our board to vote as to what those particular, how they felt those particular categories were, whether they were a nuisance or whether they were a safety issue. We did not vote as to whether or not they were a health issue, because we felt that was outside of our purview. When it came to noise, we felt that everyone felt that it was a nuisance, and 5 out of 7 felt it was a safety issue. When it came to the low-level sound, we felt that all of us felt it was a nuisance and it was not a safety issue. When it came to vibration, we felt all of us felt that that was a nuisance, and none of us felt it was a safety issue. When it came to the light flicker, 6 out of 7 of us felt as though it was not only a nuisance but also a safety issue because of its distraction characteristics. And then when it came to ice throw, 5 out of 7 felt it was a nuisance, and it could be a nuisance, and 7 out of 7 felt it was safety. So we have tried to stay away from the health, what we felt were the health issues here in this health document, which is designated as a health impact study. So it was probably, from the state's point of view, I feel, and I think the board did too, felt that the entire document was more germane to to the Board of Health than it was to us, but we used it as a stepping stone. And I would like to say that our staff has developed a library for us, a reference library for us as individuals to go in, and they're pulling out information that they feel is important that we know before we move forward with the development of our regulation, or bylaw, which we were hoping to have a rough draft by the end of May. And so we have a lot of work to do before then. And I guess one of my questions to the Board of Health is, have you established some kind of a timeline for moving forward with your regulation, or are you at the mercy of the state in providing you more information and you can't do that?
I would say the latter is true.
Okay.
We do not have the data that we need in order to create a viable and enforceable regulation. And I would like to mention, too, that this study that was done by the panel is essentially a literature review. It summarizes literature from many places throughout the world, and in a sense, it poses more questions than it answers.
Yes, Rich, first?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Ralph said, we did, and I was with the majority on a lot of those points, but it's important to understand that what we were talking about is noise. Can noise be a nuisance? Absolutely. Can sub-audible noise be a nuisance? Yes, absolutely. These things, what we didn't do, and what we haven't done, and the hard work is to say, at what levels do those become nuisance? What we didn't say was that those factors being complained of against the town's wind turbines are a nuisance. We haven't found that either. What we're tasked with doing is coming up with specific standards where those factors do become nuisance and rise to a level that become nuisance. That's going to be the harder part, and that's where there's going to be a lot of dispute. You're talking about the popular well. I know many, many people in this town who want to see wind developed. They don't want to be continually breathing or have their grandchildren breathing fossil fuel emissions, into the 22nd century. And the fact is that the technology for wind turbines can only go forward if they are built, which is why I am strongly against having any arbitrary, driven by subjective complaints, standards for siting, on distances. I am all for having performance standards imposed, because if you allow these things to be cited and then you impose performance standards, that's the way the technology is going to improve.
George?
Well, I guess I'm curious. As you start to develop a standard, you said your challenge is really the same one ours is, except we need to see the health impact. You need to see some sort of quotient, some irritability factor before you say, okay, so what do? Get 100 people in a room, hit them with a frequency of sound at whatever, and say, how many, if all 100 say, yeah, this is irritating, this is something that we wouldn't want to live with, how will you proceed with coming up with those?
Well, I would, just a moment, Rich. Yeah, yes, sir, Ken.
We have reviewed all this information, and I want to say this is my opinion, I think it's many other members of the board. We reviewed the information, as this whole survey brings up far more questions. When I was done reading it, I had more questions than I knew answers from before. We have, in a consensus, or at least I believe, the only way that we as a board can go forward with this is we're going to have to set a standard setback. No matter what other people may want, that is the only way we're going to be able to start with a setback. The Cape Cod Commission has possible setback. A setback will help eliminate a lot of the problems. Then, at that point, possibly, we could use the Board of Health's performance evaluation. We have no way to do any type of performance evaluation in our jurisdiction. So we have to handle the properties and protect the people with what we can, which is basically going to be a setback.
Yeah, Jim? We're first. Oh, Pat?
I think what I'd like to do is define what the planning board can actually deal with. And I think I've got this, but I look forward to any interruption and so on. We can define the height of something. And the highest ones we have currently are 400 feet. We can define distances. We can define noise. And we have that now as a 40 dBA standard. We can define safety parameters. If there are any safety questions in operation, we can do that. We can define what could be determined as a nuisance. We can also define time of operation. A lot of what we have could alleviate a lot of the tools that we have could alleviate some of the problems. I think I hit all of what we can do. Have I missed any? It's okay. All right. What we could pull out of the health report is certain distances. For the attenuation of noise, they're looking at 400 meters, which is approximately 1,313 feet to achieve a measurement of 40 dBA. But then they also say topography creates problems with that too. And as Ken pointed out, the Cape Cod Commission has a standard which I believe is 10 times the height of the tower.
10 times the rotor width.
10 times the rotor, okay, as a measurement for setback. Shadow flicker was another one defined in this report, and I don't know whether you've ever hit 28 when the shadow is coming across there now. I just did the other day. It is extremely distracting. They say 1,400 meters, which is awful close to a mile before you're not going to get any effects. It's 4,593 feet if you want absolutely no shadow flicker. Ice throw for a 400-foot turbine, and that's a safety factor. They're defining it as 800 feet to achieve no danger of ice throw. And we are possibly one of the worst places that you could be for ice accumulation here. So we have a number of measurements that have come out of this report. And it appears throughout when we were discussing anything, and it also appears tonight, that the best protection for Falmouth is going to be the setting up of a distance that we can live with until we get more definition that you want for health effects, which are probably going to be many years in the doing. From what I'm seeing, other nations are also studying this, and I would hope that we can make use of whatever it's found, whatever they find, in as timely a manner as can be done. We are also looking at other jurisdictions, other nations, other jurisdictions here in this country that has a presumptive no harm as a guidance. So we are looking at that, and I just wanted to help you understand better what we can look at and do when we fully understand how your hands are tied until there is far more research definition.
Jim?
Yeah. Some of the information that we have in our library I've been studying, and one of them is a report that was done in 2004, a model bylaw for land-based wind energy conversion facilities. And that goes on to talk about a state regulation 310 CMR 710. And it explains here that the state rate prohibits increases of more than 10 decibels over the ambient noise. And it goes on to say, but both these levels are measured at the property line and at the nearest residence. We have a number, we can measure decibels of sound. I think we could do a performance-based measurement of sound right now. And I think that's been in place, this recommendation's been out there for 8 years.
Yeah, just a moment, Rich. Yes, Mr.
I just want to jump into this discussion about measuring sound if I can. It's sort of central to what you're really trying to get to. We started off talking before about the difference, you asked the question about the difference between the A and the C scale. When you just read the Code of Massachusetts regulation, what you read off was a dBA value. dB stands for decibels. A stands for the A-weighted scale. The background and the history here, so we're all clear on this, is that at one point in time, people realized that people would go deaf if they listened to too much noise. It led to the A-weighted scale, and it led to a determination that at 85 decibels measured on the A-weighted scale, over a certain period of time, different levels of exposure, different distances from the device making that noise, you would go down. You would damage your eardrums. That's the underlying premise for how a lot of things go on. And more importantly, those were measuring devices typically, a jet engine, a large-scale motor, that's pretty much making a sound on a frequency of between 800 to 3,600 RPMs. So the way you measure the sound also has to include how frequently you measure the sound. Because when you go up to measure sound for any standard to see how you are, you don't measure it necessarily continuously. You measure it intermittently. I'll give you an example, and I'll go back to the turbines here. If the turbine blade is turning at a certain low revolution, which it is turning, and there's a very loud sound for one fraction of a second, but for the rest of the next 5 seconds, there's no sound. The average is quite low. when you measure it all that way, but that peak at that moment in time might be objectionable, might be a nuisance. So the issue, one of the central things that we're back to the state saying is, as John says, what's the proper scale to use? And what's the proper way to measure it? Because it's not just setting a value of 10. There's a lot of other background that would say if you're going to measure if you're 10 dBA over the background level. We do it for noise studies, we do it for airports, we do it for machinery. You measure, you take a reading every so often, and then you go do the analysis. The folks who have been living near these turbines, both here in Falmouth and other places, have done a good job of pointing out that the sound profile, if you will, the modulation and the amplitude of the sound off of the turbines is not the same as the modulation and the amplitude of the sound off of other devices because of the difference in their speed and the way the waves are formed. So central to setting up a performance-based standard that you can utilize, while there's already something in place, you're suggesting adopting a standard that's applicable to protecting the hearing and is not a standard or a way of measuring it that might be going to the heart of what's the impact upon people's sleep habits. And so, unfortunately, the state has done a fairly decent job of saying there is a problem around the sleep issue. And they've left open this big, how are you going to measure it? And what's the number that's really going to be used? So I just wanted to do that discussion around, because people keep trying to grab a hold of something in front of them. They say there's a number there, but it's always decimals on the A-weighted scale. And it's always going back to protecting your hearing.
Yeah, Richard?
That just calls for a standard on the DBC scale.
And somebody said a standard that's applicable to turbines.
Yeah,
I don't know what that is.
that requires that you have
I don't know what
data.
that is.
And in order to get data to establish that, you have to have wind turbines in operation. And if you set siting standards such that wind turbines can never be sited anywhere, you're never going to get that data, are you? That's how technology improves, is trial and error. And you don't know that speed, because that is regressive, that is reactionary, that is regression. And that just means that we continue to be breathing, our children, our grandchildren, and their grandchildren are going to continue to be breathing fossil fuel emissions. And this is a technology that we should have been developing 30 years ago.
Let it go.
But things stood in the way. Now we're getting this local opposition to, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't regulate, absolutely we should regulate, but we've got to regulate in a way that doesn't cut the technology down, doesn't prevent development and improvement of the technology. The first cars were considered to be monsters. They were horrible. But a lot has happened over the 100-some years since the 1920s when the first automobiles got in the field. The technology has improved greatly. Why? Because cars were used. Cars were being put into service, and cars were improved.
Rich, I think we understand your point. Okay, Doug?
So, we've got a lot of different guidelines. The GOER says 1.5 times the tip height of the turbine, at its highest peak. In Europe, a lot of places use 3 times the blade height, and I understand our turbines almost meet that. There's one house that's within that, and even with that guideline, it's not really working. Then the 10 times the turbine height, if we use that in Falmouth, that would be 1.5 miles or so, away from the closest residence. So we have a unique situation here in Falmouth where the southeast wind is the prevailing wind. So we're not going to just be able to say, 1,400 feet or any particular number times the rotor blade width. We're going to have to say, is it upwind or downwind to begin with? Because downwind is going to need a lot more room because, it's louder on that side. So that's one thing we're going to have to consider. And the other thing we're going to have to consider is requiring the equipment to be certified and looking at what the equipment is, because some equipment performs better than others. And I don't agree that we should not look at the equipment and say only that we're going to just measure the sound, whatever it is, because I think we'd be doing a disservice to the applicant if we don't say, is your equipment certified and what type of blades are you using, examine that whole package, and everything I think is going to have to be a site-specific analysis. I don't think we're going to have one rule that's going to fit all in Falmouth. And I think we should do our own sound studies and develop our own analysis, because we're probably capable, as anyone else is, of doing our own analysis here in Falmouth. We've got a great stage for it.
I'd like to ask Gail, I'd like to ask the Board of Health, is sound the only issue that you're considering in your study for health? Because the planning board is looking at noise, infrasound, vibration, light flicker, and ice throw. We felt those 5 things were germane to nuisance and safety. All we've talked about tonight is basically sound, with the exception of when Pat talked about what the planning board has looked at in the past. So I'd like to add, is that the only issue with wind turbines that you're looking at, is noise? And
No.
George? Well, I'm sorry, I asked you. Yeah, and then I called on you. My mistake. Excuse me.
I would say that we have discussed all of the issues that you mentioned. However, there are state regulations for sound. And the original letter that was sent to the state in March 2011 asked for the appropriate measures for measuring sound from the wind turbines, and therefore, along with that, the appropriate metrics for establishing whether it's a nuisance or not, and so forth. Our original feeling was sound regulations are in place. They need to be adjusted for the wind turbines. We asked the state what is the most appropriate way to measure wind turbines. We realized that they probably would have to be turned off at certain times, on at certain times, and we did not know the ramifications for that, and that was the original letter. Since those regulations do exist, we were following that line to try to determine what levels correlated with the data that we have gathered on the complaint log that we established well over a year ago. We were going to do those analyses. However, not knowing that information as to how to measure sound from wind turbines, it's impossible to do that.
Yeah, the answer goes back to your original question, which is sound the only thing a Board of Health would look at relative to the turbines? And the answer is, if the state, in their study, had any other quality of that turbine that they deemed affected the public health, that would be something we would regulate. The sound, of course, is the most obvious one because it's the one we hear. But if it's something below the normal way to measure sound, then of course, if the report identifies it, then we're going to pursue it. But sound is the little apple on the tree here because it's something people can ostensibly measure.
Yeah, sure.
Ice throw is obviously, in the abstract, a health issue. If you get hit with a piece of ice, you're hurt. But we really look at that as a safety issue. And I think we have approached this as sort of what is the thing that's going the farthest in this case. So if you think of it as a distance setback, and that's something that you guys can address in terms of various nested distance setbacks. Sound is noise pollution, is air pollution. It's regulated as air pollution. It has a specific, in our case, a regulatory context of air pollution regulated by the DEP. And it's also, in the case of these turbines, it is probably the one with the largest would be the largest effective setback. It would still be a performance-based setback if you wanted to, say, require a sound study and have a modeled distance and a particular performance standard But then, in terms of going forward, in terms of developing a regulation, there are a whole variety of different types of setbacks. Ice throw, it falling over, flicker, and that is where the planning board and coming with some regulation for siting, where that's all up to you guys determining what is acceptable. From our perspective, and also from my personal perspective in terms of setting a performance-based standard, which would still be protective of health, there's going to be a certain minimum distance that will be, or minimum sound that will be acceptable. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. A certain maximum sound level, which is going to be regulated as noise pollution by the state, that we will either incorporate in regulations or pass through regulations from the state. So that there is a certain boundary in terms of a noise regulation that the state will pass through, basically, that we will implement. And so anything that you do in terms of a setting a performance-based noise standard is going to be something less than that. Because the state is just going to say, this is what we consider damaging to health. Right now, that's 10 decibels on the A-weighted scale, which is clearly not sufficient for this purpose. So you can still there will still be presumably ice throw setbacks, flicker setbacks, falling over setbacks, what have you, and then there will be some noise setback, because that will be, again, considered either, from our perspective, noise pollution, air pollution, and then some tighter constraint that the planning board sets as protective of the well-being, the property values, et cetera, the future planning of the community. And so that is something that it's a number that isn't set. And it's something that can depend entirely on the equipment. And it depends on the topography. And it's something that would need to be modeled, because based on some real live data, but still something that would have to be, some constraints would have to be put on how that would be suggested. I mean, so, but there is a certain bound that will be set for no air pollution. And that's where our regulatory intersection with this is.
Pat?
Okay, I've asked this question a number of times, and it does have to do with sound. It's appearing that you all from the Board of Health are saying that the dBA is just not a satisfactory measurement of sound for what is creating the problems here. And we haven't determined a satisfactory measurement. The question I've always asked is, when we're looking at something like DBC, when we're looking at the low-frequency noise, it does seem to be creating the problem. Is there any kind of table that, because dBA is the most common measurement, that would equate to a low-frequency noise? I've read that low frequency travels further than dBA. Is there some distance of travel table for these different components of sound that we can use as a standard, that perhaps you can use as a standard? Because the World Health Organization says that you shouldn't experience any more than 30 dBA inside a dwelling to be able to get a decent night's sleep. Denmark has just brought in a new standard, which is 20 dBA. So if you're looking at standards for what is good, but you also know that seems to be the low-frequency sound, the pulsing effect, too, that creates the problem with people. Is there some kind of a table that correlates these values of sound?
Because the travel of sound is dependent on the topography, the air temperature, whether or not there are leaves on the trees, for example, so seasonality. That's the sort of thing that there isn't a straight table. There are complicated calculations that a computer can do that you can model and say, that's why people hire sound, acoustic consultants. They say, this is software which has been developed to do this, to model this based on the topography of the area. Now, it is very clear from the people from the residents who've complained to us that there's a very strong effect of topography on this particular noise. And so it's not clear to me that the models are perfectly adequate to that at the moment. Just sort of as a warning. But it's not a straight table calculation. So I don't think you can just say this distance is how sound travels when you try to put it in a regulation.
Okay, then my objection to that sort of thinking, and it's not really a criticism, it's a generic statement that I want to make, because it goes all over the place. When you say, well, there are too many, not you, generic you, when you say that there are too many variables that go into this, it's almost like throwing up your hands and saying, well, that's it, we can't deal with it, there's too much going on. I'm looking for something that we might be able to do a standard, say a worst-case scenario, and then say, okay, how often is that worst-case scenario with the topographical permutations in there going to happen? And is this something that we could do as a town to help you, to help us? Is there enough information there to be able to equate it to the 30 dBA WHO statement of the interior noise for sound sleep, or the 20 dBA Danish requirement?
I think at least in the abstract, there's enough understanding of how sound travels to be able to say there's these types of acoustical models which are appropriate. But because they're continuously in development, it might be better to require a certain quality or certain level of sound study from an applicant, for example. Such as the town has had its consultants produce. Now, the problem is you do get into dueling consultants, but that's perhaps why it would make sense to there needs to be perhaps an external referee on what type of study is acceptable, whether there's a certain range of software that the state determines that these are the most appropriate models, or the Acoustical Society of America, or however. I don't know, I haven't looked into this.
So what I'm really saying is as the Board of Health, when you put in that request to the state, maybe you should get a little bit more specific and say, this is what we are asking for, if that's a possibility to do. Because otherwise, it sounds to me like, well, without definition, the state can spin its wheels forever, trying to decide what they want to do. That doesn't help us. We've got a rolling topography here. We're terminal moraine in many instances here. And it seems to me that we're being used as an example all over the world. And I think maybe we could help the world by requiring this and saying, this is what we're looking at from Falmouth's experience. And we would like this type of data to help us get a health bylaw in place and get the planning bylaws in place.
Yeah, Richard?
One other variable, when the standard is, the World Health Standard of what happens to people sleeping inside a structure is the characteristics of the structure.
Of course.
The vibrations, how the design and the materials of the structure will affect it, and that's something that you can't get, because, there are so many different techniques of building houses, so many different materials, that you're never going to be able to get a uniform standard for that.
Well, the World Health Organization did.
One of the things which we were trying to do with the complaint log was to get people's observations about when they were affected. At the same time, we were logging the meteorological data from the top of the turbines. And the idea was that a state consultant could come back and sit down with that data set and say, here's where people are being affected under these wind conditions, these wind speeds, in this direction from the turbine, we get this complaint. And it's that sort of data, I think, which is going to be able to let the state, in some objective way, say, well, you know, if we come down and actually then measure things and can equate it back to what the meteorological data was on the top of the turbine at the time that we've gotten the complaints, that we'll be able to sort this out. And I think that's an important part of the process.
Question?
Yes, Bob.
You gave some setback dimensions. What was the one for sound?
Sound is 400 meters, which, you know, about, let's see. To get a sound level of 40 dBA, 1,313 feet.
Okay, and we were talking about 1,400 meters for flicker?
For flicker, which is 4,593.
So I'm wondering if we're just hitching our wagon to the wrong aspect. If we hitched our wagon to the most restrictive.
Which would be flicker.
Yeah. And base it on that.
I mean, there's, from the health aspect of flicker, there's two things. One is the potential for epileptic seizure. That has been, the health study discounted that because it's very intermittent and it's sort of more of a diffuse look at it. There was actually a pretty good review that was written about that. Any other setback from flicker is then going to be purely on an annoyance or distraction. So that's completely your fault.
Yeah, Jim?
Another thing that I've thought about this when we measure it, I think it's important when they're deciding where these measurements taking place. They do mention the property line, and they also mention at the nearest wall of the dwelling. I think as far as a property rights issue, it has to be not at the nearest wall of the dwelling, but at the setback for any potential dwelling on that land. You could have a 4-acre parcel and have a house way in the back, and to set a wind turbine bylaw, the only place you can build on is the back acre. You know, I think it needs to be measured at the property line and at the setback line. Those are the two things, in my opinion, where it should be measured.
Right. Okay, just going back to the agenda here, we've talked about the health study that was examined by both boards. As far as the jurisdiction on noise, health, and nuisance, I think we've pretty much established the fact that the noise is the major issue for health issues. And so I think that the planning board can deal with the other issues that are not noise related, unless we feel that they can be considered as a nuisance and safety, and that's something we have to hash out yet. The time frame for November town meeting. I mentioned that it's the planning board's goal is to establish and present to town meeting some type of regular bylaw, a zoning bylaw that will affect the future development of wind turbines in the town of Falmouth. And we're working hard at that. I would say that our staff is working hard at that. It's just about, it's our primary function and focus right now. If there's anybody else that wants to speak tonight about if we haven't covered something that you want to cover, if we haven't discussed something that you want to discuss, then I would entertain that you bring it up at this point. Yes, George?
I'd just like to clarify and perhaps ask the question, because the noise piece of it you mentioned is clearly health, unless it represents a nuisance. I guess my question is, the planning board's definition of nuisance doesn't have to be necessarily connected with the state's definition of nuisance in the law that we deal with, correct? So my direct question is, how does the planning board decide what a nuisance is?
Well, we discussed that considerably at our February 1st meeting in February. It is defined in our current regulations, and see if I can find it. And I can read it.
Sort of that relative to the noise issue. Is there a definition in your law that talks about nuisance noise, or is it tied to the state regulation?
Right.
Ralph, I've got it.
You have it? Because it's specifically, we have in our current regulations, what we consider is what is considered as a nuisance. Would you read that, Pat?
It's under performance requirements. It's 240-110, nuisances. No use shall be permitted which would be offensive because of injurious or obnoxious noise, vibration, smoke, gas, fumes, odors, dust, or other objectionable features, or be hazardous to the community on account of fire or explosion or any other cause. No permit shall be granted for any use which would prove injurious to the safety or welfare of the neighborhood into which it proposes to go, and destructive of property values because of any excessive nuisance quality. So it's extremely broad. It could be interpreted to be in the eyes of the beholder.
So it's pretty, there's quite a few adjectives. Quite a few adjectives in there. Rich, yeah?
Just quickly, the concept of nuisance comes from the common law, not from any statute or regulation. And whenever any regulation like that is got to be applied, it goes right back ultimately to the courts and then the appeals court and the Supreme Judicial Court to rule whether the regulation is consistent with what is considered to be...
Sorry, Rich, it's the application of the regulation.
Yes, the application.
Not the regulation, because the regulation is
No, the
different.
application of the regulation go right back to what that common law would define as being a nuisance.
Okay.
And essentially, it has to be some substantial interference with the right and enjoyment of abutting properties or nearby properties.
And that's decided primarily at the board level, is appealed at the court of competent jurisdiction.
There are a number of court cases as well.
Okay. Stephen?
At the risk of causing more confusion, since part of the conversation seemed to come to the shadow clippers perhaps being the easiest thing, I want to point out that the 1,400 meter value that was given out there happens to be a distance beyond which you can no longer perceive the shadow flicker. However, the actual shadow flicker and the effect of the shadow flicker is a direct function of the diameter of the blade and the speed of rotation. So, for example, a 300-foot blade is casting a 600-foot diameter shadow flicker at a certain frequency, which as you drive up Route 28, as you know, in the last week and a half, it's hitting the highway at the perfect time in the morning for us all to get an appreciation. On the other hand, if I have a 14-inch diameter blade on the turbine on the back of my boat that's making 600 watts, if you have a good optic, you can still pick up that flicker at that far distance, but it's a much different flicker. So I'm just throwing that out there. It has nothing to do with health. And as you wrestle with what you're going to say or do, when you get to the flicker issue, understand that it has a lot to do with the size of the blade, speed of the blade as well.
Yes?
And just want to also clarify, we've been a little loose with our terminology, noise. We mean sound in many cases. So it's the low frequency sound is also noise. Just to be clear on that.
Anybody else with any final comments? Yeah, Doug?
Is there someone in town who's making an ongoing history of the overall experience that we're having in Falmouth with our intern, compiling the data into historical, because this could become our own study, you know?
I'm sorry? It could be what?
Just wondering if the whole Falmouth experience is, somebody is in charge of compiling the whole thing. Is there a person?
Gail, do you know if anybody is doing that?
No, I think various issues have been tracked by various people, but I don't think it's brought together into one place.
Brian, would you have
Not at this time.
Okay. All right, well, I guess the answer to your question is we're not sure. We don't know. My guess is that there are different entities that have looked at different things over time. I believe the town has hired some consultants to examine the current issue.
I think a good overview of our current analysis of our current situation could help lead us with some information going forward, because as we've noticed, you know, there's a lot of opinions about setbacks and a lot of ideas, and we could lean toward the Cape Cod Commission, which wind advocates say is prohibitive, and there won't be any development of wind if we use the Cape Cod Commission guidelines. Maybe work backwards from there. But I think that, you know, to compile all of what's going on in Falmouth would be a good thing for us to look back at and help us in our going forward.
Okay, we can maybe ask our staff to look into that, and you might as well. Anyone else for any further comments for this evening? Anything that you think we didn't cover? Are you going away satisfied that this meeting has accomplished what you wanted it to do? Yeah, Ken?
Well, one thing I want to say as a member of the planning board to the Board of Health, I thank them for coming here tonight, because some of the things that I was able to pick up made me understand it. That they're totally different. They are stuck with federal and state regulations. So as a lot of the people out there tonight think that maybe they're not doing what they hope they would do, they're doing all that they can do. But us as a planning board, we have the trump card. No matter what the state says, we can always say yes, but we are the elected planning board, and we want to protect our townspeople by this much more, and we have the right to do that. And I hope the planning board the Board of Health understands that we're looking at those options as well.
One caveat, we cannot be arbitrary. We have to, any decision we make has to be based on some rational nexus with reality and the best interest of the community as a whole, not simply any isolated group.
Well, in my 10 years on the planning board, I haven't experienced any situations where we have been other than rational. I don't think we are arbitrary, and not in my 10 years. I've never seen it. So I think we're in good shape there, Rich. I don't think this board, I don't think the planning board would ever indulge in that type of analysis. I wouldn't take it personally. I was talking about the planning board. Anything else? Anybody? I thank the audience for coming, and we will look forward to your comments when we develop. The planning board will look forward to your comments when we have a regulation to put in front of you, and then we have public hearings where we will solicit your input. I will say, I will offer also to the Board of Health the library that our staff has put together. It's in the planning board office, and I see no reason why you, if you have the time, wouldn't be able to take advantage of that. As a matter of fact, we have an updated list that our staff gives us of the publications and documents that they feel that will help us, and I'm sure that there's information in those documents that would be helpful to you too, if you so desire. So I hope I haven't overstepped our bounds there. We have a few extra chairs up there and a place for you to sit down and read to your heart's content.
May I make a...
Sure, of course.
The health office also has been compiling a library of articles and documents on this issue. So perhaps it would be wise to merge the two, make sure that at least there is one place where all the documents exist.
Why don't we leave that up to the staff of both the boards, the Board of Health and the Planning Board? And maybe you could work that out.
I don't talk to you.
You know what?
I'll check.
Okay. You can see already that the wind turbines have affected my hearing, and that I'm not picking up everything that I need to pick up. Final comments from anybody here on either boards? Again, thank you to the public for coming tonight, and I thank the Board of Health for asking us to get together and for providing us with information and where you are and where you're going, and hopefully we provided you some information about where we are and where we're going. The timeline is a difficult situation, and I think it's going to be easier for us to establish a timeline that's reasonable and where we can take something to town meeting, and you probably are going to have a more difficult time because you're waiting on the state for more information. So with that, yes? I'll accept. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
It's one vote.
Yes.